Hello and welcome to a video of a somewhat different format than what I often post. This will just be a straight up normal video without any scripting, so it's not really planned. I'll be showing you this little leather work case. It's been requested that I do this by at least one person, so I mean there's at least one person who will find this interesting, I hope. But yeah, so this will be basically a walkthrough of the tools that I normally use when I work on typewriters. And I happen to store them in this old tool work bag. It is not made for typewriter mechanics in particular. Actually, it's made for the old government branch or organization that maintained the telephone system in Norway in the past. You can see that when I open this, because it's, let's see, right here it has the mark Televerket, and Televerket just basically means the telephone company. So their technicians would be given this and they would fill their bags with the tools they needed for their work, and now I have it and I filled it with typewriter tools. So the bag itself is really nice. It's thick, solid, robust leather. And on the sides you have these little buckles that you can open up. And when you do, you can pull out the flaps and the entire thing lowers to give you a good insight into the entire contents of the bag. And I can see now that the camera doesn't really capture all that, so let's try to adjust this. So the plan for this video is that I'm going to go through at least most of these, or some of them, and tell you what they do, why I have them, how I use them, and whether or not I would consider it recommended that you have one. So yeah, let's just get to it. So the first thing I want to show you is probably the least useful item of the bag. It's called a precision instrument, or more specifically, it is a Shore A durometer. Now, many people, they understand what that means from the word durometer, duro meaning hard, and it is just a tool that will measure how hard something is. So the idea is that I will use this on a platen. That's the deal for it. So you would just push this little pin right underneath here. You will push that down onto whatever surface you want to test, and you can notice that the arrowhead goes way up. Now, it's not really useful to know how hard a platen really is. You don't need to know that. You can tell that if you push your nail into it and you can just tell it's really hard. That's all you really need to know. I have it just because I kind of like putting a number on such metrics. This is just nylon string. It's not made for fishing. Many will swear to just fishing wire or fishing nylon thread. You can use that, no problem. This is made to hang up your pictures on the wall. So it's spec'd to carry 25 kilos, which is a lot. Now there's a lot of fishing wire that will also be spec'd to carry that kind of weight, but that kind of thing will often be a little bit costly, and this being quite thick makes it easier to make a knot on it to stop it from flowing out or going out of, like, when you're pulling it through. And it's cheap. So this works for most typewriters that I need to replace the drawband on. There are cases of older machines that will want and use fabric, and for that I have this. But this is spec'd and made to be used by fishermen when they are repairing their when they are repairing their fishing nets. So this will manage great even though it gets wet. So this is useful also when dealing with something that might get oily. It will remain good. Most typewriters won't want something like this, but the older ones will. Another thing that I will also often use is gloves. This is nitrile gloves. I use gloves when I work because, for several reasons. One of them being just, I don't necessarily like how my hands will smell after I've been working with old and greasy, dirty machines. The stains on your hands can be hard to get out. So I will use gloves, but there's also the health benefit. Now, typewriter technicians and mechanics have worked with typewriters for decades, and if there was a case that we knew that the oils and the mineral spirits and whatnot was really hazardous to your health, we'd know that already. But it's not great, is it? So, I mean, you can treat joint pain and joint issues of the knees and hands by rubbing ointment on the knees. So it's clear that we know that the skin is able to pick up shit. So why take the chance? I just use gloves. No worries. Okay, moving on. This is the next up. This is a Power X, or an X-Power blower, basically. There are equipment you can mount on the tip here to make it like a nozzle. And I use this to blow out, well, dust, first and foremost. And that's useful, but more useful than that is that when I'm cleaning with mineral spirits, I need high pressure air to remove the old mineral spirits out of the components. So I use that in place of a air compressor. So that thing works great. It's cost efficient. I've been had it for years with no technical issues or problems. And I even know a couple of people who have both an air compressor and that air blower thing, and they still prefer the air blower over the compressor. So, hey, I can only recommend it. Next up, this is a bit of skin grooming equipment, or nail grooming equipment, in that it is a set of various kinds of tweezers. Tweezers, the word. There we go. Now, do you need a big set of various sized tweezers? No, not really. Do you need tweezers? No, not really. But they come in handy from time to time when dealing with tiny screws that need to be put into fiddly positions and whatnot. So it's coming useful, and it's not costly, so I find that's fine. Next up, these are actually spring hooks. Let's see if I can get it closer. But I do use them sometimes to get into crooks and nannies, like small areas where I need to be able to either just scrape off gunk or whatever for some reason. I don't know, but when I first bought them, I bought them to be spring hooks to help me work with springs. They ended up sucking for that, but I've used them for plenty other things. They've turned out to be useful, so I kept them. This is anyone who works with restoration that will know this product. There we go. Renaissance wax. This stuff was made by or for the British Museum, basically, yeah, the British Museum. So it's made to be a product that is non-corrosive and protective, and will be used on any kinds of material from metal to paintings, marble, leather, wood, stuff like that. Now, there's some disagreement in the community. I know that people are using this to polish their paint, to make their paint pop, but I'm not completely convinced that this is a good product for that. So, but what this is good for specifically, like, is if you have bare metal that have started to rust and you're treating the rust with either a brass brush or some other material, and this is good to put back on afterwards to give the surface a little bit of protection. That's what I use this for, bare metal that needs protection. Okay, moving on. There is, this is just a set of precision screwdrivers. It has various sized flatheads. Now, I only really ever use the flatheads, of course, but with they have like a rotating head, so you can easily push it into your palm. Then start screwing while giving pressure inside the palm. They're good enough. They work. They're there's various names for them. I'm not really sure which one is the more correct one. Hollow ground or parallel ground, stuff like that. Basically what that means is that if a screwdriver is hollow ground, instead of being shaped like this, it will be shaped like this. And the benefit then being that when the screwdriver enters the slot for the screw, it won't, like the shape of the normal one would maybe make it skip outside of the slot, and hollow ground ones won't really do that. Now, that sounds like a huge benefit when you're dealing with screws that stick, right? And yeah, it is. That's why I also have this set, a Chapman bit set. The Chapman bit set they are in fact hollow ground. Maybe I can demonstrate on a big one here. And you can see how it goes down and out instead of just going straight down or in a angle down. These are super good for getting screws that stick out, but you have to be careful when you use them, because since all the energy goes directly right either onto the screw head itself or into the slot of the screw, or the bit head itself or the slot of the screw, all of that energy goes to rather thin pieces of metal, and you'll be surprised how little torque they can take before they actually break. And that goes both for the bits and for the screw head. These will annihilate a screw head if you're not careful. If you encounter a screw that you can't really get out, you need to use some more finesse, being maybe chemical help. I will use this liquid wrench penetrating oil. This stuff is really good when it comes to seeping into the threads of screws and making them unstick, and also for other things that might stick in a typewriter. Most people will usually have WD-40, and WD-40 will also work, but this I feel is better. It's also made in a way that when the pressure is released out of the can, it's not going to do what WD-40 usually does, which is to come out with such force that it sprays everywhere else in addition to wherever you need it. So that's points to liquid wrench penetrating oil. I really like that one. So yeah, be careful. I only use this when I have a screw that is actually stuck. The reason for why I don't use it more is the fact that this, when you mount everything, this head on the tip is actually very impractically thick. You can't always fit it into wherever you need it to go, because their typewriters will have many very narrow nooks and crannies. Brass brush. A brass brush will be very useful for many things. There's also, if you go into the shop, you'll find brass brushes, but you'll also find steel wire brushes. And steel wire, I would recommend you don't use for the most part. You can. There are many pieces in a typewriter where you can use a steel wire just fine. But steel will be stiffer and harder and will more likely leave scratching marks than what is likely with a brass brush. You should also be aware and know that many brass wire brushes, I don't know how many, but there are cases of vendors or marketers who will sell you brass brushes, and when you get them and you start using them, you start noticing that the steel, the brass will actually start to flake off or get removed, and you're left with what is very clearly a steel brush after all. So they've somehow taken the steel wire and they just coated it or plated it with brass to make it look like it's brass, but it's steel. Next up is this is a homemade pouch, but it contains precision wrenches, or some call them ignition wrenches. So this will be for really small nuts. You have metric sized ones on the right and imperial sized ones on the left. It's very rare that I actually need these really small ones, but it's nice to have it. These are Moody Tools wrenches, and they're bladed, as it were. We call them bladed basically just because the tip of these kind of, well, it looks like a blade, doesn't it? Sort of. It's very thin, so it's easy to slot in where you want. One thing I'm not too pleased about is the thickness on the ends of these tips, because again, like I said, typewriters are usually very narrow and crooked spaces, and sometimes the thickness of those blades will actually be too much, and I'm not able to actually work it particularly well, which is annoying. Microfiber cloth, nothing special about this. Microfiber cloths are good for just wiping down. Well, I don't really have to tell you why a microfiber cloth is good, do I? Everybody knows that. Get you some! Next up, this is a jig for soldering types or type slugs onto type arms. I've never actually had to use this yet, but I got it because I felt it could very well come a day where it would be really handy. So the idea is, of course, you get the type arm right inside here. You can use this screw to adjust how it will sit when you seat it down. There's a screw here where you can alter like both angles and how far out you want the slug to sit, so you can really finely adjust and tune so that every slug for every type arm is mounted or set at the right, just the way it should be set, which is good. And it's potentially it's one of those tools that it's not really useful very often, but when it is useful, it's super useful. Okay, next up to perhaps the one more interesting one. This is also a homemade pouch, and in it I keep my very typewriter specific pliers. Okay, so this is a three sets of 3-prong pliers. You'll notice that it has 1, 2, 3 prongs, 1, 2, 3 prongs, 1, 2, 3 prongs. So I guess a 9-prong plier. This is used to make bends. So what you'll do is that you can notice, I don't know how noticeable this is going to be. If you notice here, there is very little gap when I push it together. Here there's a little bit more, and here there's even more. So these pliers are to bend metal of various thicknesses and to make very specific bends just on the point of where the top prong goes down. So this would make a bend like this. I've used this several times to form type arms when they need sideways adjustments, because you can in theory just you can use your finger and try to bend the type arm sideways, but if you do that, the bend will be made right in the bottom part of the type arm, right where the type arm meets the segment, which isn't ideal. You can end up making a type arm stick that way. By using this one, you can push it in the way you want on the middle part of the type arm and make a bend right on the middle instead of making the bend further down. So you have more control and more likely to end up with something that isn't necessarily screwed up. So these are pliers that I got from an old typewriter mechanic here in Norway that he used. What he used this for was to actually make peening bends, is what we can call these, by using these edges right on the neck of type arms, so that he could form them going straight forward or backwards, because he preferred to make bends using peening. It's an old technique, I'm going to get back to that. Okay, so these are also a set of bending pliers, also made for type arms, to make sideways bends. The thing about these is that they are made probably for machines that will have thinner type arms. Most more antique machines, they won't actually fit into the slot right here. So these have, I think, never been actually used by me. By the way, I do hope that it doesn't get too annoying that stuff is very often out of focus here, because I'm trying to hit the focus spot on the camera. Okay, next plier. So this, you can also call this a 3-prong plier. You have 2 points and a middle point that will move up and down. So these are used to make vertical adjustments on type arms. So this is good if individual type arms seem misaligned, and so that you have, so every single letter is perfectly on one line, but the A somehow sticks up just a little bit more. You can use this to adjust how far down or up on the platen the A will hit. If the A hits more than a couple of millimeters above or below, this might not be the right tool for the job. You might not want to make that dramatic an adjustment with this. You can try, but there's if it's a couple of millimeters out of whack, more likely the soldering in the slug will have fractured and moved away, so that the fix is actually something else than forming the type arm. So consider that if you are having an issue like that. If you bend it, and any bending will always create microfractures in metal and increase fatigue. If you're unlucky, you can snap it entirely. Again, we have another one of these forming pliers, but in this case you can see that we have screws on the sets, and you can screw these out and rotate these heads, so you can match the two various types of interaction with the plier itself. So you have like the slot for slotted, you have small dots right here. This would be, if you put these together against each other, this would make a really good peening plier. So this is sort of a multifunction tool for bending, for peening, sometimes cutting. You can notice how this actually has a more of a sharp point to it. So this would be able to cut metal. So these are multifunction, does many things. It's probably really replaces this tool quite efficiently, really. So that, again, this one doesn't see much use at all. These are straight up peening pliers. Like I said, peening is the process of bending metal so that you can create in a very controlled manner. You know what? Let me actually yeah, here we go. This is a type arm from a Lettera 32 Olivetti. So pliers like these would be made to make bends on the flat side of metal. So you would put it in the mouth like so, and you can see how this would then create a sideways bend by the flat side of the metal. Now, for example, these pliers, they would be made to make vertical bends on type arms by placing them inside of the mouth of the pliers like so. Let's see, pretty close here. And you can see that by putting tension and force on this, you would make a bend so that this would actually be bent more curved around this point. Again, by turning the plier upside down or the other way around and creating a bend like force, you can see it doesn't fit well because the type arm on the Olivetti is so small. But here you can then make a bend bending the other way around. And finally, peening is a way of replacing this kind of plier. Now, what will happen is that all the metal surrounding the points where these peening pliers push in, they will be pushed outwards. And what will happen is that the metal will actually create a bend. But you can see on the type arm, well, maybe you can't. There's a very small dent in the metal. So you would go about and you would use this like a couple of times, like 3 squeezes around. And this, if you measure this, put it like in a socket so you lock it in place, draw an outline of it, and then make peening, you'll notice that in this case the head will have moved a little bit back. Good, okay, that's that. Onwards to the more simpler stuff. I have just normal magnetized screwdrivers. Nothing magic about it, in fact they're quite cheap. Okay, so my brain isn't working so I can't remember it, but these are famously used in surgery, but the idea is that they have this locking mechanism beneath, so you can pick up something with it, and then you squeeze it, it will lock in place down by this spot, and it will end up holding whatever you've pinched onto it, without you having to hold on to the scissor. And then you can release it by pushing them back and lifting up again. I've used them to hold the screw in place, I've used them to hold on to drawbands, etc. I have two, one is smaller and longer than the other. Smaller and longer. One is smaller than the other. I also have one of these things. This is a, well, I don't know the actual name for it, but I call it a screw grabber. It's if you just push in this, a small grabbing arm comes out. So the idea is that you would use this if you drop a screw into the machinery. I can easily just stick this in, find the screw, and pick it out. So it's really helpful. These are my actual spring screws. They are much more have much finer edges. And on the other side, specifically, or especially the other one, you can see on this one that it has sort of a curved tip. So these can be good to just hook onto a spring and carefully navigate it to where you want it, and then angle it out to put springs in place where they need to be. Really useful, and definitely one of the things I very often pick out. I keep some brushes, just straight up fiber or plastic, like hairs. They're just to get dust out. These are pliers made actually for people who make fishing lures in the side, like fly lures. But these have been one of the more useful pliers that I have because of the bent edge and also the various sized holes in the mouth of it. There's also something just straight up called a T-bender. Now this is it's a metal rod, isn't it? But on the end of it you have a small slit, and the idea with this is that you can use this to stick down into a typewriter through like all the mechanisms and just place the slit onto whatever metal piece you need bending on, and you would turn it to create a bend on that very exact point. This is super helpful for so many reasons. You can then make bends on parts on the typewriter that needs forming without taking every part above whatever you need to form away to get to it. So this is a huge time saver and a really useful item. Finally, I feel it's also useful to mention I have these tiny things, these tiny bottles. There's one for either IPA or mineral spirits, depending on how I want to work, and one with straight up sewing machine oil. Now these have a very fine metal tip, which for the cleaning material really doesn't matter, you don't need that, but for the oil it's really good because you can get some very small amounts of oil to wherever you need it to be. And you really do want to have very small amounts of oil, never too much. Okay, that's about it. Now I have several other tools in a cabinet behind me. I could make this video even longer, but I'm not gonna. So yeah, that is the tools that I usually use whenever I work on typewriters. And I hope that it was useful information. So good luck on finding your own, because especially pliers like this aren't necessarily very easy to come by. Now and then they do pop up on eBay, so that you can get a deal from them there, but there are other people who are also very actively looking for them, and usually whenever they pop up, especially from the reputable vendors, you have to be prepared for a bit of a bidding war for them. It can get expensive. Alright, that's it for now. Good luck on your hunt, and I'll see you again later.